You guys hear me now? Can you hear me now? No? Oh, fun, fun. All right. Okay. Awesome. So, anyways, thank you for those of you who have hopped on. Please get the likes up, tag anybody on this particular broadcast who you think may find it interesting. Also, just real quick, if you just like this content and want to see more content like this and want to show support to the show, you can find me on Cash App or Venmo, Shay Charday. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring on our special guest. Let's see. Hello, hello.
Hey, how are you? Is it possible to do the landscape way for your? Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Now I can hear you. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you. I was saying, is it possible to do the landscape for your view?
Oh, let me see. You talking about for the visual,
Yeah,
like that
yeah,
one?
yeah. Does that work for you or?
Yeah, totally. If it works
Okay.
for you, I'm good.
Yeah, that works for me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have you on. Um, to finally speak with you in person. I know you have created many conversations and been creating a bit of the buzz in the manosphere in particular. So I'm really excited to have you on and just share your perspective.
Okay, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the invite.
Yes, absolutely. And again, for those of you who have opted on, please get the likes up, tag anybody on this broadcast you think may find it interesting. We're going to hop right into the questions. And just for the sake of time, I will only answer questions that come through the super chat, as we have a lot that we want to cover off this particular evening. And I also want to be mindful of your time.
Okay.
So, just to get right into today's topic, obviously we're going to be talking about the Black Manosphere. Would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit, just telling us more about who you are, and just how you even got into YouTube?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't know me, my name is Brother Omowale. I'm a grassroots organizer out of the Philadelphia area. I currently serve as I guess you could consider it like the interim ambassador for an organization called Afrocentricity International, which was founded in 2011 by Dr. Malefe Asante and Dr. Ama Mazama. My presence in terms of on YouTube, I've been on YouTube passively for about the past 4 years. I have a bigger or more consistent presence on Twitter. But
Mm,
back in August, I started to kind of like take the content creation thing on YouTube a bit more serious. So I've been consistent, I guess for about the past month and a half, putting out content on a weekly basis.
okay. Awesome. Awesome. So you've just now more recently been really merging your Twitter and your YouTube together. Is your plan to do a lot more content and focus more on YouTube? Or are you planning on doing really both, hitting all
Yeah,
bases?
yeah. My plan is definitely to focus more on YouTube at this point. Really, I have a content plan and strategy, but focus on growing this particular audience to introduce a different perspective to a conversation that's been happening, among Black men, here in this particular space.
Okay. Awesome. So what made you want to create a Manosphere channel?
Well, what made me want to create my podcast, the Race, Manhood, and Power podcast, is a response, as I see it, to the global crises playing out in African manhood.
Mm,
So a lot of the work that I do as of late has been focused on how do we develop Black men in real time. I've always been an advocate for Black men. A lot of my writing and a lot of my following on Twitter came from the fact that like I've been speaking out very forcefully over the past 4 or 5 years since I've been on Twitter for Black men against a lot of the anti-Black misandry that we see on spaces like Twitter, and given a lot of pushback on both an intellectual level, well, more so on an intellectual level via
mhm,
essays to the Black feminists that really kind of like controlled that particular space over there. So
okay.
I've always kind of like been in the space somewhat advocating for Black men,
Mhm,
but I really wanted to kind of like step it up a bit. And I knew I wanted to launch a podcast this year, and I wanted to, after giving some thought as to what it would be, I came up with the concept of race, manhood, and power as a response again to the global crises in African manhood. And in terms of why the manosphere, I feel that the manosphere is a particular space where men come to offer their thoughts, their ideas, and their
Right.
perspectives on
Right.
things pertaining to Black men. So I felt that that would be the appropriate space for my content. And I also didn't want to preach to the choir, so I chose not to go into the conscious community with my content because I feel like that can be a bit church-like. I'd rather go to
Yeah.
folks who probably are not familiar with the type of content that I produce.
Okay. Okay. So I see a few comments coming in here. I see I'm a Black nationalist, Afrocentric separatist, and a Black Manosphere supporter. I am also a Black Briton from London. Shout out to Malarkey 5. See Omowale in the house.
Mhm.
See some. Yeah, I'm just looking through the comments. Okay. Now, would you mind just expanding a little bit more, real quickly, just for those who are not familiar, what you said as the global crisis you say for African manhood? Would you just mind expounding on that just a little bit more, and what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, Black men have existed in a perpetual state of crises. I want to say for about the past 400 years. Using
Right.
the terminology of someone like Dr. Tommy Curry, I would refer to us as subjugated males that who exist under a particular system that is designed to dominate us and
Mm,
maintain us at a particular level. Um, and in terms of how we experience crises related to that, uh, my argument is that this particular system was never meant to socialize us as men for anything healthy, right? It wasn't meant to socialize us to be sovereign and in control of our reality.
right. Right.
We were brought here to be socialized to be a labor input into someone else's economy.
Fair.
And now that the economy has made several adjustments over the past 100 years or so, it calls into question uh, our I guess usefulness as an input into this particular system. And I
Mhm.
think that as a result of that, our situation as a group of men is very precarious, and we see it playing out in many different statistics in terms of Black men just not being or doing well, right? So Black men basically existing in a
Right.
state of crisis.
Right. And you're saying this isn't just, in America or in the West. You're saying this is a global crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, wherever we are right now, I don't care if it's Haiti. There's been videos coming out of places like Kenya, where
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
African men being whipped in the head by Chinese managers of mining fields. You know what I mean?
Wow.
So there's things happening in places like Haiti where African children are being exploited uh, by child sex tourism. And when
Wow.
you see these things happening in your environment, right, the role of manhood is to be a protective perimeter for a group or for a people. So if these things are happening in an environment where men exist, then there must be a crisis in that type of manhood, or that manhood must not be providing the role that it's meant to provide.
Mm. Very, very, very interesting. I remember when I went to Africa the first time, and I had a kind of conversation with my husband about this. While I think the first time I went, I was going on a mission trip, and I think I just was just unaware of certain things. And I remember this particular mission trip. They were talking about, oh, we need to help build the wells in the water, and they were, supposed to be helping a group of people who they've been there for like thousands of years, but I guess there was issues with water, and they're saying people are being sick. And so I remember that was like a big focus, like help them get clean water, help them do all these different things. And then I remember talking about my husband about that later on, and he was telling me, he was like, well, why did that happen? Why do they have bad water? Why are they in that state of being? Because like if they had been there for thousands of years and they were doing well and fine, why all of a sudden do they have bad water?
Yeah.
And it really made me think, like, wow, like I didn't really think about that. Like even in Africa, you hear some of these things happening, like, oh, crisis here, crisis there, crisis everywhere, but you don't necessarily, we're not even being told why sometimes,
Hmm.
so um thank you for those of you who have hopped on. Please get the likes up, tag anybody on who you think may find this interesting. We are talking about the Black Manosphere, and I'm really excited to have our special guest Omowale Afrika to have him just give his perspective on the Black Manosphere and just things pertaining to Black men in general. Also, in the sake of time, I'm only going to be answering those questions that come through super chat. So if you guys have any questions, anything that is you really want to hear discussed, definitely send your super chat and we will try to get to it. Okay, moving on to the next question. What is your opinion of Black male studies as a whole?
I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm probably one of the biggest advocates and supporters of Dr. Tommy Curry. I have an interview lined up with him
Okay.
later this week that we'll be releasing in November. But I mean, it's necessary. Like, Black men have been dehumanized. We've been criminalized. We've been pathologized. So to have a discipline introducing itself to the academy that is designed to gain back our humanity and push back
Mm,
against a lot of these narratives that have been constructed to reduce us in society, it's a wonderful thing and it's something that I support 100%.
absolutely. I will say many of my followers know we have like a study or have like a series going on called Black Men Built This. And it was kind of an effort to address some of the common narratives I've heard today from unfortunately Black women in particular in the community who are basically saying Black men, they don't build, right? They haven't built this. They haven't been contributing to society. So I will say, just even as a Black woman, really trying to delve in deeply and see, the impact that Black men have had, not only in ancient times, but even, up till today, to modern times, despite some of these different challenges, in spite really a global system that has been against, Black people and Black men in particular. I found that to be really inspiring. So,
Yeah,
I appreciate studies like that and hope to see more things that can help, restore the humanity back, if you will.
absolutely.
Hmm. Um, okay, so from your research, what would a Black or African centered political and economic standard look like?
Well, if I was to kind of like break that into two, first dealing with the political and then dealing with the economic,
Hmm.
from a political perspective, for me, it would look like sovereignty over our land, our people, and our
Hmm.
resources.
Mm.
And that's
Okay.
something that has been removed from us,
Mm.
as a group, as a collective across the globe since the period of colonization. We've existed again as a subjugated people under a system that is meant to kind of like dominate us and keep us in a certain space, right, within the hierarchy, right, keep us at a certain rung on the ladder. So for me, it would certainly look like sovereignty and control over our resources. And in terms of economics, I think the thing that drives economics is I think first of all we have to understand what economics is.
Right.
And so if I was to give a definition, I would use the textbook definition, which basically states that economics is the optimal allocation of resources under conditions of scarcity, right? And in focusing on that term allocation,
Hmm.
right, the allocation of resources or even the relationship that a group of people has with resources is going to be based on the axiology or values of that particular group. And for me, values are not something that are universal, right? The set of values that the West operates based upon, or the philosophical idea which animates the West, which is a concept referred to as materialism, is something that in many ways is antithetical to what we've seen play out historically within African civilizations. So to answer your question, how would the resources would be allocated? I
Right.
think that they would be allocated in a way, and this is very an oversimplification because I guess the question is a bit more complex, but I'm really trying to simplify it. But
Right. No, I hear
I
you.
mean, they will be allocated in a way that is more in alignment with our value set, right? The challenge with um, a materialist construction of the world is it really not only does it reduce humanity, right, and dehumanize us as people, and that's across all races, but it also kind of like desacralizes nature and it this is a complex topic, but
I hear you.
it puts us in a space where I don't know, the economy. It's like an economy. A materialist conception leads to an economy just built upon like destruction, built upon dominance, built upon objectification, uh, and control. And I feel like all of those things, in many ways, are antithetical to the set of values that we've seen historically that have animated African civilizations.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. So you're basically saying like the system that exists now, apart from it being oppressive, it's also it goes against nature and it goes against some of the different values that were inherently African centered. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at the values of indigenous people all across the globe, it seems as though like you spoke to your husband spoke about, these people were able to have clean water for thousands of years. And the
Right.
reason is like these people have developed cultures in which they are able to live in harmony with the environment around them. They
Yeah.
understand that there's like a reciprocal nature and that things are not just here to be used and driven to extinction for profit. But for some reason within Western culture, there seems to be like this, I don't know if it's a homicidal or genocidal ethic that they aren't necessarily, it seems they don't operate in harmony kind of like with the natural world. And as a result, everywhere they go, they seem to produce death. And that's across all of their systems, but especially their economic system.
No, I understand. I've heard it said, and don't quote me on this totally because I'm certainly not the expert, but I've heard it say that much of the economic and just economic system that stems from the West, it's based upon the philosophical ideas, which is that nature and the spirit and matter, like they're all separate, and there's
Yes,
this idea that
that's a
nature,
concept referred to as materialism.
right, and that nature is one of those things to be dominated,
Yes,
versus something that you're supposed to live in harmony with. So if you
yes.
see nature, something to be controlled as something that's antithetical to you, then it would make sense that under that system, you wouldn't necessarily see a value in maintaining nature or maintaining harmony. Um,
You don't see value in life, period. Right. And in addition to that, you don't even see yourself as a part of nature. You see nature as something that is separate and apart from you. That's a very Eurocentric kind of like construction of how you make sense of the world around you. But I mean, they again are the youngest group on the planet, and other groups have built and developed civilizations and have lived on this planet for much longer. And I think that, if we talk about Dr. Francis Cress Welsing about Europeans being driven based upon the fear of genetic annihilation, their posture of aggression towards almost everything that we see down here, it I guess it makes sense when you understand them and their culture.
hmm. Now I see the super chat. Thank you. Let me see. African people are in crisis anywhere and on the planet, ruled or controlled by the European. Hello, Professor.
Hello, Sister Awa. How are you?
Also, for those of you who hopped on, please get the like, sub, tag anybody on this broadcast you think may find it interesting. I also mentioned earlier, just in the interest of time, I'm only going to be answering those questions that come through on the super chat. So if you have any, burning questions that you would like answered, please feel free to send in your super chat.
Yeah.
So just continuing on the question, I do know it's a rather loaded question. I saw that you shared the video that we talked about beauty standard, and I first of all I appreciate it.
Mhm.
I'm curious. I've had many conversations with my husband about this, on how the economic system and the beauty standard in general are very much interconnected. For example, it's like if we know that in this Western system, the economic system is controlled by the West, they're also going to promote beauty standards that are, based upon, Eurocentric features.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is related to the social and economic question that I mentioned. Do you also feel like a a part of that process would be really pushing an Afrocentric beauty standard as far as helping to restore the humanity back to just African people as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the first part of your question, when you spoke about, let me see, I have the question here. It said, what would a black/African centered political and economic standard look like? Well, you the third part of that, right? Because it really should be three. It should be cultural, political, and economic, right?
Fair,
Because
yeah,
the
fair.
cultural is certainly going to drive the political and the economic. But the significance of the political, if you recall, I stated that a political standard would look like us having sovereignty over
Yeah.
our land, people, and resources. And by sovereignty, I mean control, right? That is what has been removed from us. So, as a result of not having control over our land, people, and resources, we also don't control our culture or the values um, that drive us as a collective, right?
Mm.
Economics, if you break it down, like the etymology of the word, it's a very simple. If you go back to the Greek term, it deals with something called household management. But like you can't manage the resources of the household if you don't control them. And
Mhm,
that's the problem that we're faced with as a people.
mhm,
And again, the resources, I broke them down into three categories: land, the people, the resources. But and by land, I mean like the natural resources. I could also say our labor, but that's also a component of the people, right? So
mhm.
land and people, right? The predominant resources that we should have control over, but we don't. And because we don't, that means that the standard that
Mhm.
drives or controls our people and controls our minds, the institutions that miseducate us really only serve to further the propaganda of the people who control our resources,
Yeah,
and
right.
we're educated in a way so that we can be okay with being subjugated or be okay with not having control of our resources. And that's how miseducation works in our people.
No, totally, totally, completely understand. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Um, all right, so moving on to the next question. Or did you have anything else you wanted to? I know that was like a loaded.
No, this is good. This is good. I wanted to spend some time with these questions. To be honest, I've just been so busy
No,
on
no
these,
worries.
but these when I saw them the first time, I thought that these were good questions, and then I didn't want to over prepare because I didn't want to seem rehearsed. So I just wanted to kind of like speak off the cuff.
Yeah, all good. All good. All right. So how should black men respond to female content creators that promote misandry?
I think that black men and black women collectively should respond to female content creators that promote misandry by repudiating them. I mean, I think it should certainly be um, denounced. It should be called out. But I do think that there's a fine line, right? Because
Hmm.
sometimes when you call attention to some of these folks, you're actually just giving them the attention that they desire and
Yeah,
helping them to grow.
yeah.
So you have to figure out, do we ignore it, or do we call it out? And if we call it out, how do we call it out? Right. One thing, and someone asked me this yesterday on the live. They asked me if I would support censorship of certain
Mm,
perspectives, and my argument is no. I would not want to go to the Europeans or the people who control these platforms and ask them to censor certain perspectives, because what will happen is once they start to censor, those of us who have nationalist or radical or revolutionary perspectives, we're going to be the first ones who get captured by the censorship net. So for me, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So I don't promote censorship. But what I would say is I do promote the development of our own institutions and platforms that we can then control and say who can come on and what can come on. So if we controlled the platform, then no, there would not be any room for anti-black misandry. So I guess there's that.
that makes sense. I was completely just in the dark about how big of a platform exists for um I guess just men haters and especially black men haters. I just had no idea. I really had no idea. And it wasn't until I guess I started entering the space a few months ago and even more recently, me trying to just see what women are where women are going, looking at some of the, more popular female content creators. It was surprising and also very disturbing to see there be not only such hate, but for that to be so normalized, for that
Well,
to
you
be.
you have to. So here's the problem that I have with focusing solely on black female content creators who promote anti-black misandry,
Mhm.
because in my mind, like they're low hanging fruit.
Right.
The only reason they're able to thrive is because they exist within a system that promotes anti-black misandry at its core, right?
Fair.
Institutionalized, right? The police are anti-black misandry. The government is anti-black misandry, right? So they're really just riding a wave. They're going in the same direction of the current, right? In terms of the current in which the society exists
Yeah,
within.
that makes
So,
sense. That makes sense.
they're low-hanging fruit. And I think that we should raise our gaze and look at the institutions that are far more dangerous than an independent YouTube content creator that is promoting and supporting anti-black misandry, because that the one allows the other to thrive.
No, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. You kind of have to get to the root. You have to address the root problem, or else you kind of just be, dancing around in circles.
Yeah.
So, for those of you who have popped on, please get the likes up and tag anybody on this broadcast who you think may find it interesting. Also, if you have any questions that you would like answered, I'm only going to be answering those with super chats just in the interest of time. So feel free to send in any send in your questions. And again, we're just talking about the Black Manosphere. I have Omowale Afrika here, just sharing his perspective and yeah, just giving us some insight on the topic. So it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm trying not to be too reticent, but this is my first time here on your platform, and I do want to make sure I'm also answering all your questions. So
Yeah, all good. All good. Okay, on to the next question. Do you think a strong spiritual identity is necessary to navigate past the Black gender war?
yeah, absolutely. Because you have to understand that the Black gender war is driven. I said this yesterday during the live that
Hmm.
our unhealed trauma is the greatest weapon in the hands of our enemies. And by enemies, I mean both internal and external.
Hmm.
And at the root of the Black gender war is unhealed trauma. It's feelings of rejection,
Yeah.
of resentment, and of betrayal on
Yeah.
both sides. So when I listen to a lot of the brothers who, consider themselves to be in a war of attrition with Black women, and when I listen to some of the women or sisters themselves to be in a war of attrition with Black men, as I try to listen carefully to hear what their arguments are, I think that there's so much commonality that they really could just benefit from having a moderator to help see both sides of the issue. But
Right.
at the end of the day, if they don't do the work to kind of like heal themselves and heal from whatever trauma it is that has even caused them to seek out these spaces where they could nurture their resentment for the other group, then the war will always go on, because again at the very core of it is unhealed trauma. And I do think that spirituality or having a spiritual connection plays a significant role in your ability to transform and heal from whatever trauma you've experienced on this plane.
Right. No, that makes sense. Um, do you have any thoughts on Marcus Garvey's theology?
Well, I what I what I'll say is this. uh People misinterpret Marcus Garvey's theology quite a bit. If you read in his message to the people, he
Mhm.
first thing he argues is that we should create and establish our own theology, right? Develop our own kind of like aims and our own like spiritual direction, right? So people will argue that Marcus Garvey was a Roman Catholic. I think that Garvey attempted to use the religions that the people were already in and in some ways radicalize them towards aims of liberation, right? That was his goal. Another thing he says in the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, he says that there are a million religions, and his argument is essentially every man interprets religion for every man or woman interprets religion for themselves. So there is no kind of like common religion that is common to all, because we all have our own independent interpretation, because we're all our own universe. So he was a lot deeper thinker than what many people kind of like give him a credit for. But my main focus when it comes to Garvey is on his skill set for diplomacy, on his skill set for organizing, and for inspiring the people to act on their own behalf. I think that we can draw from the many lessons that he left for us to kind of like study, and try to implement them in the work that we are doing today.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I myself I'm learning more about Marcus Garvey myself, and like many people who came before this, there's things that you agree with, there's things that you maybe don't agree with, but you try to take the good and expound upon it. So okay, I see this super chat coming in again. Thank you. I see Shay Sade. For those of us who are not familiar with you and your work, can you give us an overview of the type of content you do and your objective? That is a great question. Well, just real quick. So I started this channel a few months ago. There's a couple of things I focus on. It's definitely like a femininity channel, but there's a big lifestyle component to it. So I touch upon many different things. Relationships being one thing, Black culture being one thing, spirituality, Christian living being one thing, health, exercise. So there's a gamut of different things that I focus on. I also love to have different content creators to come on and share their perspective, talking to small businesses, different people in the Black community, just to have some of these conversations that I think are pressing on people's lives. So there's a few different things that I focus on, but I guess my target audience is speaking to women, especially African American women, speaking to different Christians or Christ followers, and then just people in general who want to have honest conversation. So that's kind of what I'm about. I've only been here for a few months, and definitely planning on to expand and do some more things. But yeah, that's what we're doing. So I appreciate you stopping by. You are more than welcome to check out any of my content. I'd love to hear from you. I love to hear feedback. I'm always open to constructive criticism or just questions or concerns. So like I said, feel free to take a look and leave your comments and questions in the comment section as always. So all right, let's moving on to the next question. Okay, can you respond to criticisms from Black men who identify with the West and don't see the value of Afrocentricity?
And by respond to criticisms, are you saying what they're criticisms of Afrocentricity? Like, can you help me understand this question a bit
Well,
more?
I'm saying, okay, so I'm saying men who Black men who identify as a Westerner, or maybe they identify with the Britain or the Queen of England, things of that, and reject having a Afrocentric identity. What would be your response to that mindset? Because I can say personally, I've very much seen that kind of ideology within the manosphere and the Black manosphere in general. So it's always interesting for me to see both perspectives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that. Uh, are you familiar with husbandry, right, or like farming? Like,
Yes, farming. Yeah.
yeah. So I think that there's a way that you can kind of modify the growth of a crop, so to speak,
Hmm.
to cultivate a certain type of output,
Hmm.
right? So, in terms of those individuals who you're speaking of, I would argue that over the past 50 years, that the institutions that uphold the Western world have really sought to cultivate that type of thinking and mentality among our group. So I'm not very surprised when I see people who say they really see no value in Afrocentricity or see any value in a Black community, or see any value in us being connected as a collective because they see themselves as part of the overall Western or white collective. And but for their Black skin, they would be fully assimilated and amalgamated into that perfect union that they've kind of like wedded themselves to. So, I mean, I don't think that Afrocentricity has any use or value for someone who is not looking to build and develop as a Black person. Like, if that makes sense. Like, I think that if their identity as a Black person or an African person is useless to them,
Hmm.
then a theoretical framework that helps them to fortify that identity would also be useless, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
no, that makes sense. That makes sense. And you're saying this is essentially people, Black American people who they're fine with, things the way they are, and they want to find the way to maximize what's already in place.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's very normal. I mean, even under the system of enslavement, there were people who were perfectly okay with slavery, right? There's a reason why
Mhm.
uh Nat Turner, for an example, if you read the history on Nat Turner, he had ran away before he did the led the rebellion, but he came back, and when he came back, he decided to lead a rebellion. But before he led the rebellion, he kind of like kept things to himself, and like a lot of
Mhm.
the enslaved people who were on the plantation with him were looking at him like he was crazy. Like, why would you run away and then come back? But he came back because he was planning the rebellion, and he had
Mhm.
to figure out who he could share the information with and pertaining to his plans, because he understood that not everyone on the plantation, and I have a saying that I say even today, because I still operate with like looking at things with a plantation mentality, and my argument even today is that I say that you have to be careful speaking around black people on the plantation, because you never know who's a slave.
Mm.
And I think that Nat was very clear on that, right? That there were people who were in fact slaves on the plantation, and they had no desire to be free, because in being a slave, their greatest aims and aspirations was to please their master and to attain the comfort that they could achieve by being a good slave,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah,
every
that's true.
rebellion that we've had, you'll see in the court documents a list of informants listed as informant X, informant Y, informant Z, right? And those people survived and procreated, and they have children, and we're
Mhm.
overrun with their children today. So again, I'm not surprised by the slave mentality amongst slaves.
Mm. Right. And you're saying at that point, trying to have a conversation, trying to have an open, honest, or productive conversation with somebody who has a mentality would kind of be unproductive. Because it's
Yeah,
like,
that I mean, and
yeah.
it could also be dangerous. I mean,
Mm.
coming out of the period of the '60s, the period of rebellion. I mean, the black community was overrun with informants.
Mm.
The so-called black conservative movement is what it is today because it's been uplifted and cultivated by the United States government. I mean, there's
Mm.
literally I speak to this all the time, but there was a memo that was sent by Daniel Patrick Moynihan to President Nixon on January the 16th, 1970, with 4 points for dealing with the black problem. The first point we're all familiar with is benign neglect. But the fourth point
Mhm.
is to uplift the so-called silent majority. He was basically saying that there is a very conservative and moderate element within the black community, and the more exposure or prevalence we can give to that community, the better off for us, right? So I think that we are kind of like overrun with those types of individuals today. So it's very difficult to try to build a movement based upon our collective uplift, because those folks already see that they've kind of like arrived, and they've attained their position on the plantation. So if you're trying to escape the plantation,
Mm.
they'll
Yeah.
likely tell on you or inform on you, because you're going to mess up their plans.
Right. Right. That makes sense. So then you would say that Black conservatism is very much against the progress of, African centered identity, and just a system that is beneficial of Black people as a whole.
It's certainly against the progress towards African liberation or sovereignty, because what are you conserving, right?
Mm.
Dr. Amos Wilson used to say the education of an African child and a European child has to be very different. Why? Because the European child, his responsibility is to maintain the system that his predecessors have built for him. Whereas though the African child, he should be educated to destroy and build a new system, right? Because the system that he exists with under is built upon his back. So if
Mm.
somebody is conservative, you're trying to conserve a system that is built upon your back.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. No, that actually didn't think of it that way, but no, that makes it's an interesting way you put it. um, for those of you who have hopped on, please get the likes up and tag anybody on this broadcast who you think may find it interesting. We are talking about the Black Manosphere. I've been having a conversation with Omowale Afrika, and he has been just giving his take on the Black Manosphere and just different issues pertaining to Black men right now in general. So it's been quite an interesting discussion. Um, Just now, just somewhat of a side note, and I know this was I didn't totally send this to you, but this came up, in the last week or so, just trending in the YouTube space. So I think it might be worth just getting your perspective on. I'm sure you've heard of Cynthia G and the whole conversation on just the whole conversation regarding aborting black male babies,
Yeah.
and I think her recent video, I didn't listen to the whole thing, but one of her recent videos was her trying to argue how black women can indeed exist without black men being alive. Um, I can't think how that's I can't think of how that's possible biologically, but I just know it's created quite a stir. So do you have anything to add on disregarding that whole controversial topic?
Yeah, I did an entire live on it.
Hmm.
I I believe on Sunday did an entire live addressing that. I referred to them as the bottom dwellers, and bottom being an acronym for the band of traveling misandrists.
Mm,
But I mean, her articulation of aborting black male children is very homicidal and genocidal. When I first heard it, like growing up in the church, and you said that you have a Christian background, so you may be familiar with some scripture, but
mhm.
there was a particular scripture, I believe it's Exodus 1 verses 15 and 16, where Pharaoh commands to the two Hebrew midwives that if a woman is pregnant and when you birth the child, if it's a boy child, kill it, and if it's a girl
Yeah.
child, then you allow it to live. And that's the whole story of Moses' supposed birth, right? He
Hmm.
was a boy child that wasn't killed, and he was put in the river, and they kind of like saved him because that child was supposed to be murdered, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
genocidal edict was sent out. So I
Try to kill
find it
him. Yeah.
very interesting to hear oppressed women or women of an oppressed group clamoring and I can't get the word out, championing their own homicide, right? Because we
Right.
exist in the boat together. Like we can't. There is no disillusion of black women from black men without essentially the eradication of us from this planet. So, but I don't think that Cynthia G is well mentally and or spiritually. So I don't think that, although she speaks in a very kind of like matter of fact fashion, I still think that her speaking is separated from logic. I think that it's purely emotion. So I think that if you try to understand what she's saying from a logical perspective, you're only going to confuse yourself, because it's not logic that she's speaking from. She's speaking from a deep source of pain and hurt, and a desire to see that hurt, spread amongst the group that she's had to endure.
No, that makes sense. I did a live on this myself last week, and while I've never had a conversation with Cynthia G, so I can't speak to how she is behind closed doors. Certainly, the talking points and the arguments, to your point, aren't really based upon logic, because we all know it doesn't take you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that you actually need a man and a woman to create a child. Like,
Yeah.
there's really no way around it. I know they've looking at artificial womb, and there's all these scientists looking at alternative methods, but there's none exist at this moment. So it's like, however you want to spin it, a man and a woman are both necessary in order to create to create a child. And I would argue in
Absolutely.
order to actually raise a child. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's intentional. That's how God intended it. But to your point, I was again going back to the shock factor. I think it's really been when the last few weeks where I've really started to understand how deep this I guess how deep the the web is of man hating and black man bashing content in this space. And
Well,
like I said,
it's red pill content, right?
fair.
It, so there's both female and male expressions of red pill content. You understand what
Right,
I'm saying?
right. Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
so I'm not really surprised by the growth in red pill content that we see today.
Right. And to your point, you're right, because you made the point where it's like we also see, hateful, misogynist war content coming from Red Pill. And here's the thing, some of the complaints that I've heard on both ends can be, justified, or there maybe is an element of truth to it. So it's
Yeah,
like, you don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater, but the conclusions are, I mean, detrimental, genocidal at best.
but
You know what I mean?
you have to value the baby.
Right. Exactly. Especially,
If you don't value the baby, then the water and the baby can go.
yeah, totally. All right. So I see this super chat coming in from Comjuverse. Thank you. Looks like we have a question. What does Omowale think of the growth of Black women online who use African spirituality to promote LGBTQ and feminist politics?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I spoke on that briefly in a presentation that I did called the Pan African Costume Ball and the Climate of Confusion.
Hmm.
But in short, I think that what you have is coming off the campus, right? The particular ideology that's animating this current iteration of controlled opposition
Mhm.
is something referred to as queer theory. And undergirding, well, I would say queer theory and intersectionality, right? But undergirding those two particular ideologies is something referred to as postmodernism. So it's something that is infecting, and I use the term infecting purposefully because it's like a virus,
Right, right, right.
but it's something that is infecting all of our traditions within society. And I don't think that African spirituality is excluded from that infestation.
Okay. No, that makes total sense. I will say I saw this video a few weeks back, and it was talking about how there's a lot of modern women today, especially a lot of Black or African American modern women who are supposedly turning to witchcraft to, for whatever reason, to get the results they want as a way of connecting with their spirituality, whatever. But needless to say, no, there are women who are starting to turn to witchcraft in order to try to get better results for their life. And what I found interesting is that in that particular document that I saw, there was no men present. And I heard this consistent theme of, women saying, I turned to this because it got me what I want, or, I like this because I don't necessarily, there's no rules, there's no structure to this. Like if I feel like I want to make a spell, I can just kind of make it up, or if I have a particular, desire, I can, just kind of flow. Like there is this idea of there being a very fluid structure. And then there
Yeah.
just wasn't any men. And I found that concerning.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, first of all, I think that any black person, any African person who is attempting to um access or tap into African spirituality, and you find yourself somewhere where people are referring to it as witchcraft or bruja or things like
Yeah,
that, then
yeah,
you should back away from it, because
right.
you're trying to enter into a door to access your past or to access your ancestors um, through an artificial door. And what I mean by that is during the 90s, there was this entire neo-pagan movement where white people, like Wicca and all those things, but white
Mhm,
Europeans were going and learning about African traditions and coming back and writing books about them, and they
mhm,
actually introduced a lot of these concepts about some of the deities being homosexual. Right, this came from
mhm,
Europeans, so
mhm.
I think that is very dangerous to try to access your spiritual traditions through Europeans as your mediator. So that's the first point that I want to make. And a telltale sign that you're probably going through Europeans is the fact that you're referring to it as witchcraft. But the second point is that I do think it is healthy for Black people, African descendant people, to tap into our historical spiritual traditions. If you understand anything about our history, Du Bois writes about this in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, where
Yeah.
he has a chapter, I think it's chapter 10 on dealing with our faith. And he talks about the early Christian church was, or the early Black church was not Christian by any way, shape, and form, or he referred to it as a loose band of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically he called it like voodoo or pagan rites, where he said the old priestess, right, from Africa became the leader of the church right here when we got to the United States. And one thing that you'll find that's interesting is that in 1890 when they convened the Mohawk Conference on how to educate Black people. And that conference was presided over by Rutherford B. Hayes. He was very clear that the large majority of African and or Black people in this country were not practicing Christians. Many of them were still practicing the traditions that they came over with. And you don't really see an abandonment of those traditions until you have the migration patterns to the north. And what happens is, as people migrate to the north, any traditions or practices that are seen as African are associated more with the South, and the South is associated more with slavery. So, in an attempt to try to throw off, I guess, the mental shackles of slavery and embrace assimilation, Christianity became a part of that. To say that you were a Christian and that you were a part of a church and you weren't into all of that strange hoodoo and voodoo that Black people were doing in the South, right? So we lost a lot of ourselves as a part of that migration because we had to cleanse ourselves of who we were in order to make ourselves more palatable to this nation we were looking to integrate within.
Right. Yeah, I have, a lot of thoughts. That's another conversation in and of itself, but I have a lot of thoughts on, what is described as, mainstream or Western Christianity. In my own studies, being a Christ follower, I was actually surprised to find out that just the whole concept, just Christianity in general, the Messianic faith was well into Africa before European settlers ever came there. Now, as a girl, I did not understand that. I was told all kinds of other things that made me hate myself. But now having done more research, like I actually had a Dr. Vince Ponto. He's a theologian that came on a few months ago, and he really talked about how so much of the Messiah in Christ, that whole it was already on the continent before Europe came. And so
It's
what we see now is a far cry, or very much I would say largely is a false iteration of what the true gospel really is.
yeah, I
Um,
was going to say it's certainly it's a more complex and historical
it is,
conversation
because
than
I'm like, if you were to, talk to the Coptic church, or talk to, from Ethiopia, and and you would just say, oh,
the
the European brought,
well,
the
though,
Messiah.
though you have to remember that those particular iterations of Christianity on the continent also come under the auspices of when you have like the Byzantine Empire, right, that is coming in and colonizing, similar to how Greek and Rome, Greece and Rome were coming in. So, and that regard, typically what happens is when an invading force comes into a space, they align themselves with the elite class, and the elite class are typically the first that adopt the traditions of the group that has come in, right? This is a conversation that's like we would
Yeah, like I said,
this is a
that's
yeah,
a whole
this is a different
nother
conversation. Yeah.
conversation. But yeah, I would be amiss if I was to say that. Of course, just religion hasn't been a tool to oppress people, especially people of color. It most definitely have. I think, one of my goals as a Christ follower, for just for many reasons, like I said, that's for another conversation, is to really push past some of the propaganda and really get to the truth of what's going on, to help actually bring good change. And I think a part of that is having real honest conversations, not hiding things under the bushel, not trying to make up things, not being scared to have those kinds of conversations, because in order to actually get to the truth, you actually really do have to address those things.
Agreed.
Um,
Agreed.
I see this super chat coming through. Shay Sade, would you be willing to be a special guest on Omowale After Dark in order for further the conversation?
No, I would love to have you. I'm enjoying the conversation.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Um, all right. So we are heading into the final question. It says, okay, so what can be done on an institutional level to increase the Black marital rate and build strong Black families?
Well, I mean that ties back into question 6 when you talked about like the value of Afrocentricity, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't build Black institutions with white thoughts, right? If that makes sense, like your mind can't be fixated on whiteness or Europe and you're trying to build something for Black people, because that's not going to work. So I think that first and foremost, you have to, your center has to be centered properly, right? And that becomes the significance of Afrocentricity, because from there, you'll understand the importance and the necessity of erecting institutions to meet your needs, right? On my channel, when I talk about manhood, the definition that I use is one that's rooted or grounded in institutions, right? I define manhood as a system of order, protection, and direction that is expressed through institutions that are capable of meeting the vital needs of a people,
Mm.
right? So what I mean by that is, if institutions provide us with direction, then they help to socialize both inputs into the family unit, right? The woman is socialized for the role that she'll have to play,
Right.
and so is the man, right? And
Right.
I come out of a situation, with where the Black church, when it was a strong force,
Hmm.
because my parents have been married for what, 44 years now,
Oh, wow.
but
That's awesome.
they were an arranged marriage, you
Oh,
know
wow.
coming out of the Black church, right? So I think that with like Black American families, we've always understood the need to have racial institutions to help guide us along and do for us what this country would never do. But I think that because we've abandoned those institutions, you kind of see the chaos that's now present in our community,
Mm.
right? So on an institutional level, what can be done? They have to be built. They don't currently exist. And when they are built, they cannot be built based on a Eurocentric model, because we aren't looking to produce chocolate Europeans. If we're looking to produce Black people or African people, then the values have to be Afrocentric, and we have to tap back into who we are. And a lot of that will require the negation of external parties that we've embraced and have attempted to make our own.
No, that makes total sense. I've had a conversation, multiple conversations about this where, it when we look at other cultures, it's not even really an issue. Like seeing a Chinese person or a Chinese family, you know, reinforce their values, have their own holidays, intermarry with other Chinese people. It's not a question. Indians being with Indian people, marrying within other Indian families. I mean, I live on an area where it's like everywhere I go, I'm seeing a Indian family or a Chinese family. You
Yeah.
rarely see mixing. And we see, you know, Italians celebrating their holidays, Irish people celebrating their holidays. So it's like there's, we in this country, supposedly, we're supposed to be honoring and respecting of all cultures, and knowing that there's supposed to be space for them to be able to exist and still and still thrive with their own cultural context. But for whatever reason, when it comes to Black people, they seem to be the only culture where that, if you actually try to have an African centered perspective, or if you just are interested in where you came from, it's looked down upon. But in any other culture, you don't see that. You don't see someone demonizing a Chinese person for wanting to learn about their history or for speaking their own language. You
Well,
know,
if
so
if we go back to the beginning of the conversation when we talked about the European fear of genetic annihilation,
mhm.
African people seeking to practice Afrocentricity and practice their own cultures and traditions is a threat to European society, right? Because if that flourishes, then it becomes a threat to what is currently prevailing. And what's currently prevailing is that we are voluntarily undergoing a washing of who we are over multiple generations, right? Culturally, we are already assimilated and indoctrinated into their system. But through our mating practices and through the attitudes and behaviors that we've adopted, we are also moving in a direction to ensure that we are cleansed racially as well. And that makes European society very uh, comfortable, because their numbers have always been on the decrease, right? And they have to figure out a way to still maintain dominance, because still maintain dominance even with their numbers being a minority. And a big part of the way that they do that is through the miseducation to make us act and pursue a set of, I don't know, orders, for lack of a better term, that goes against our own interests and that upholds their values, their interests, and their perspectives.
right. Interesting. Very, very interesting. So yeah, like there's, to your point, there certainly is a fear. I mean, we see that in the media. we see that sometimes in how people are treated, where there's just a fear of blackness or a fear of anything that's African, almost to the point where anything that's considered African is pagan, or it has evil, or it's dark, or it's mysterious, and it's it's like it's obviously it's because it's coming from an outside perspective, you know.
Yes. Yes.
So, anyways, well, we are right at the hour. This has been a really, really helpful and interesting conversation. Did you have any other closing remarks or anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap it up?
No, I will say that I've enjoyed the conversation. I think that given the nature of the conversation or the nature of the questions, I don't think that I was able to give what you were looking for in terms of you titled it an honest critique of the manosphere. So I didn't really put forth a critique, of the manosphere, so to speak, within this. But to your other proposal in terms of the engagement with Obsidian, I would definitely be open to having that conversation based upon the questions that you've lined up. So
Yes, yes, I've actually spoken with him, and he is very interested in also having a conversation about some of those topics. So yeah, I'll be in contact and follow with both of you guys, and maybe try to set up a date. I think that would be really cool.
yeah, and in terms of my contact info, I mean I'm online at omowaleafrica.com, and I'm pretty much on all social medias: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Omowale Africa. So if folks want to tap in, come tap in.
Awesome. I will leave his information in the description of this particular video, so you guys can go back and use it as a reference.
Okay. And to answer a question for the view, somebody put in the chat at the very beginning,
Oh, let me see.
why is an immigrant speaking? I'm not an immigrant. My father's side in this country goes back to 1784, and my mother's side in this country goes back so deep that we can only get to Alabama, and then I don't know the origin. But I am an African American. I don't subscribe to any of the hashtag identities, either ADOS or FBA, but I am an African American. But the name Omowale Africa is one that I've adopted because Omowale was the name that was given to Malcolm X when he visited Nigeria in 1964. And the name simply means the child who has returned home. And the name Africa was inspired by Dr. John Henry Clark because he says that a name should be associated with land. And for me, the most significant piece of land on this earth as a Black person is the ancestral homeland of our people. So Omowale Africa. That's there you have it.
Awesome. I didn't see that comment come through, but
It was the first comment before the stream started. There were a few Manosphere folks who were perturbed by the fact that you invited an immigrant on to speak about the Manosphere.
I don't understand. Okay, well, all right. Well, you were an immigrant, but even if you were, I don't understand the issue on that. But I guess that's another conversation. So,
Mhm.
well, again, thank you for your time. Yeah, this has been awesome, and I will definitely be following up with another discussion with Obsidian.
Okay, well, thank you for having me.
Awesome. All right. Well, you have a good night.
You too.
Okay. Take care. Bye bye. Again, thank you all of you who have who were on in this conversation. If you want to see more content like this in general, you can send in your support. I appreciate and need all the support that I can get, so I can get more resources and have more useful conversations and just content like this in general. So you can find me on Cash App or Venmo, Shay Charday. Also, I will be sure to leave his information in the description box of this YouTube video if you guys want to just see, more things that is happening on his channel. And as always, get the likes up, tag anybody on this broadcast, or share it to people who you think may find this discussion interesting. And we are going to sign off. You have a great night. Bye.